Well, welcome everyone. Just a few opening remarks. The purpose of this session is to examine developments in United States policy towards Iraq between 2001-2003 and the UK's response, and we're continuing this theme in hearings next week. I think I should emphasise that the focus of the inquiry is, of course, on the United Kingdom government decisions, actions and policies. But to understand that, it's important also to understand the development of United States policy and the interaction between them. So this session will cover foreign policy priorities and decision-making processes in the US administration in the period, the evolution of policy on Iraq and the Middle East in Washington from 2001 until early 2003, including the decision to take military action in March 2003, and the UK's relationship with the United States over the period. I'd like to make two general points, again, as before each session, to recall that the inquiry has access to many thousands of government papers, including the most highly classified, for the period we're considering, and we are developing the picture of the policy debates and the decision-making process. These evidence sessions are important in informing the inquiry's thinking and complementing the documentary evidence. It's important that witnesses are able to be open and frank in their evidence while respecting national security. And I remind every witness that they will be later asked to sign a transcript of their evidence as to the effect that the evidence they have given is truthful, fair, and accurate. We have with us today Sir Christopher Meyer, who was our ambassador in Washington throughout the period under discussion this morning. Welcome, Sir Christopher.
Good morning, and I apologise for my delay in coming. Reasons almost beyond my control.
Thank you. Well, without more ado, can I turn to Sir Martin Gilbert to open the questioning? Martin.
My first question, Sir Christopher, relates to the months leading up to the election of President Bush, and wondered if you could tell us briefly what you learnt yourself during those months of the views of the senior members of the incoming administration, in particular Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, with regard to Iraq.
Well, it wasn't until fairly late in the day in that year that we knew who were going to occupy the chief positions in the Bush administration. So until that became clear, to find out what was going on, what was being planned, it became necessary to speak to members of a group who were known informally as the Vulcans. The Vulcans were a group of American advisors who advised George W. Bush when he was the presidential candidate. And when I went down to Texas in early 1999, which was shortly before he declared himself as a candidate, he said to me with very great frankness, I don't know much about foreign policy, I'm going to have to learn pretty damn fast, and one of the things I'm going to do is surround myself with good people. And the good people turned out to be this group called the Vulcans, led by Condoleezza Rice and Paul Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz, of course, who has become Deputy Secretary for Defense. So my team and I focused on this group. And as the year 2000 went by, certain policies began to take shape. And I think the most definitive account that I had of where the Bush administration was likely to go, and always bear in mind this is before 9/11, self-evidently, was a conversation with Condoleezza Rice at the British Embassy on, if I remember rightly, the 6th of December 2000, followed by a conversation with Karl Rove, who was President Bush's chief political strategist at that time. And over, I suppose, a 90-minute discussion at breakfast on the 6th of December, Rice spelt out the outlines of a Bush foreign policy. I already had instructions from London to put in a few fixes on how we wanted certain things to develop. And I have to say to you that Iraq and the Middle East did not feature very prominently in this account of where Bush's priorities would lie. There was an enormous focus on Russia, not Russia as Russia, but on nuclear missile defense and what was going to happen to the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which she and later the president would make, I think, the top foreign policy goal of the period before 9/11. On Iraq, I just want to say a little bit more about context on Iraq in a moment, but on Iraq it was, we need to look at this, things aren't going well, the policy of sanctions is in tatters, the smuggling, Saddam Hussein's getting away with blue murder, and we need to do something about that. So I suppose the batting order there was nuclear missile defense, Russia in that context, not a lot about the Middle East. I remember her saying to me, we don't want President Bush to become the Middle East desk officer like Bill Clinton, because Clinton was in the final throes of trying to fix the Arab-Israel problem, which eventually failed. And nor are we terribly keen on doing that in Northern Ireland either. So we got a heavily missile-centric account of foreign policy. 2 days later, I think it was 2 days later, I saw Karl Rove, and he more or less gave me the same account, but emphasizing that, as with most presidents of the United States, in the first few months you focus on your domestic priorities, not on your foreign priorities. And that was the very, very clear message from Rove. It was going to be tax cuts, it was going to be education, it was going to be health care for senior citizens.
In fact, it's interesting that in your book, DC Confidential, you write, for example, of those first few months about Colin Powell, that he was always skeptical about belligerent notions for dealing with Saddam Hussein. What were these belligerent notions of those you spoke to at that time?
Well, the belligerence of that moment focused on arming and financing Iraqi dissident groups. If you went up on the Hill, as the embassy team and I did quite frequently, what you would hear from Republican senators and their staff was, there are some really good dissident groups out there, we need to finance them and arm them and shake Saddam's foundations. Now the group of choice was something called the INC, the Iraqi National Congress, if I remember rightly, most of whose members seem to have been located in London, and who were led by Ahmed Chalabi, who has frequently featured in what happened in Iraq since then. And there was a view on the Republican right that Chalabi and his people were a really valid opposition to Saddam Hussein, and they only need to be equipped and armed, and they would, despite a failure of a rebellion against Saddam several years previously, should be able to do the trick. If you went to the State Department, and particularly to Colin Powell and his deputy Rich Armitage, they would say the INC is no good, it's a busted flush, we shouldn't rely on them. But that was the belligerent trend running through the administration for 9/11. Let's focus on the opposition. Meantime, and this was the greater strand of the two, if you like, the focus, particularly from Colin Powell, was on what we termed in London narrowing and deepening sanctions for a variety of reasons. The sanctions regime itself was pretty tattered. The process of approvals in New York had become totally constipated. There was a heavy propaganda campaign against them, pushed, I have to say, by Saddam Hussein himself, as saying it's the children and women and the defenses of Iraq who are suffering from sanctions. And a lot of people bought into this. And so we felt uncomfortable, both for the technical reasons, sanctions weren't doing their job, and also because it was being used as a stick with which to beat us around the head. So the duo of Colin Powell and the late Robin Cook focused for, whatever it was, 8-9 months on trying to do narrowing and deepening, and I have to say it failed.
Robin Cook's visit to Washington, which of course you were there, what was his input at that time with regard to the sanctions debate?
He had I don't know why I say this, but somewhat to my surprise, struck up an extremely good relationship with Colin Powell very quickly. Powell had come to London in either 1999 or in 2000 to give a kind of motivational speech to the Ministry of Defence on how you handle diversity in the armed forces and in the Ministry of Defence itself. And this had gone down a storm, and in the margins of that event, he and Robin Cook met in a London hotel and had a very good conversation. And I remember Powell coming back saying, "Oh, that Robin Cook, I can do business with him. This is a good guy." And strategically, they saw eye to eye very rapidly. And it's a bit like, people say, well, if Tony Blair was so close to Bill Clinton, how on earth could he get close to George Bush? Well, Robin Cook had been very close to Madeleine Albright, and he didn't find it difficult to strike up a good working relationship with Colin Powell. So Cook's input, I think, was appreciated and taken into account by Colin Powell, and it was a relationship of real mutual advantage. Can I just wind back a bit, because I want to say something about the Iraq Liberation Act. Can I do that?
Yes, of course.
Because it sets a kind of context. Maybe I'm anticipating a question, in which case I apologise. But to understand the context, it has to be emphasised that regime change in Iraq was official United States policy. And it went back to the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998, when the bill was passed unanimously by the Senate. It was passed with an overwhelming majority in the House of Representatives, and it was signed into law by Bill Clinton in October of 1998. So regime change, and to quote the Act, to establish a program to support a transition to democracy in Iraq, was an official American policy which George Bush inherited from Bill Clinton. The fact that Bill Clinton didn't do much about it is neither here nor there, because he was a bit knocked about after the Lewinsky and impeachment business. But that was the policy that George Bush inherited. So sometimes people say to me, well, it was the nutters in the administration, the right-wingers, the neocons, who invented regime change. Absolutely wrong. This was inherited from a democratic administration, as were a number of other policies as well.
But at this time, you're stressing that regime change was using the Iraqi opposition. It wasn't direct intervention. Were there groups within the administration, people to whom you were talking, for whom actual military force against Saddam was being discussed at that time as an option?
Oh, I think so, yes. I think that, whether it's being actually discussed as such in the administration in those months before 9/11, it's very hard to judge. But Paul Wolfowitz, as I said, became Deputy Defense Secretary, and who was the leading neocon in the US administration, a man of very, very brilliant intelligence, harnessed to a particular view of the world and the way in which Americans should deploy their power. And I remember him saying to me years previously, it probably was in 97 or 98 when I first arrived in Washington, at which time he was Dean of the Paul Nitzer School of International Relations, saying to me, what we should do is we should invade southern Iraq, seize the oil fields, base ourselves in Basra, and from there launch raids against Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, and little by little we'll bring the regime down. Now that was, if you like, the outer fringe, the extreme fringe of the belligerence movement. But that as a policy between, say, January, Inauguration Day, and 9/11, I don't think ever got into the mainstream of US administration debate, which continued to be focused on, as I say, narrowing and deepening sanctions, and what can we do with Ahmed Chalabi and his people.
So when you were preparing the visit of our Prime Minister to Camp David to see President Bush in February, what briefings were you giving with regard to the dynamic within the administration, from the sanctions supporters to the wild men, if you like, of the wolf of its time?
Well, for Camp David, or was it 22nd of February, 24th of February, Of course, Iraq was not gigantically high on their agenda either. And I just have to say one thing, despite the best endeavours of the Iraq Inquiry Unit, which I think have done a fantastic job in assembling the archives, I have not been able to find, to refresh my memory, the 5 telegrams I sent before the Prime Minister's inaugural visit with the President, to refresh my memory of the wisdom or otherwise the advice that I sent him. But before the meeting, as what sort of diplomats do, Rice and I decided to try and clear away as much of the foreign policy undergrowth as possible in advance, so that the President and the Prime Minister could concentrate on creating a strong personal relationship. Condoleezza Rice said to me, the main purpose of this meeting is bonding. We want the President and the Prime Minister to bond well, because she was saying at the time that the United Kingdom was the United States' most important friend and ally. So it's important the two leaders should get on. So the two foreign policy issues at that moment that were at the top of the agenda were the anti-ballistic missile treaty and nuclear missile defense. That was the American concern. And we, for our part, were in the throes of developing the San Malo initiative between France and the United Kingdom on building up European defense. So we, on the British side, had an enormous concern that if the Americans, and this is also inherited from Bill Clinton, I have to say, that the notion of developing nuclear missile defense, this didn't spring from the loins of George W. Bush. We were very, very worried that if the Americans went gung-ho for getting rid of the anti-ballistic missile treaty and started dismantling some of the key elements of old détente, that this could unravel seriously, could prejudice seriously the relationship with Russia and have all kinds of other repercussions. The Americans had a counterpart anxiety, which was that in developing the European Defence Initiative with the French, that we had been seduced in some way by the incredibly cunning French and were being led into a trap that would undermine NATO. So what we came up with was a draft joint declaration which would put these anxieties to bed. And that agreement was actually finalised at Camp David by John Sawers, Prime Minister's foreign policy advisor, and by Rice herself. So that was at the top of the tree. So one of the things I said, if I remember rightly from one of my briefing telegrams, was this is something we need to diffuse. If we're lucky, we'll be able to diffuse it well in advance of the meeting, which actually, in fact, is what happened. Otherwise, the kinds of things we need to talk about are the Middle East much more than Iraq at the time, actually.
Tightening sanctions was on the agenda, but I take it not something which was disputed.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't a huge item. There was a long discussion of Russia, and the president at the time, I think Tony Blair was the European leader who had, I mean, Sir Roderick will confirm whether what I'm saying is right or wrong, was the European leader who I think had most face time with Putin. He was a kind of Putin expert at the time. And Bush was very keen to sort of download Blair's assessment of Putin and where the Putin leadership was going. And we spent a long time on that. Iraq came up at the beginning really almost to be dismissed. Part of the problem was that Colin Powell, who was at Camp David, had to go. I think he had to go to the region. And so as soon as the Prime Minister and the President sat down for lunch and had sort of 5 minutes of politesse between them, the President immediately asked Colin Powell to give his assessment of where things were in the region and what we needed to do about Iraq. And then it left the agenda, as far as I know, never to come back at that particular summit.
Now, you mentioned bonding, and bonding is obviously an important question. How would you yourself characterize the impression made, first of all, at that Camp David summit by each of the leaders on each other, and then looking forward with your experiences going through, say, to the Chequers meeting on Leaders General, how did they relate to each other? And again, in particular with regard to Iraq and the Middle East problem.
Of course, the massive anxiety that I had was after the extraordinarily close relationship between between Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, that changing gear to a Republican administration and to George W. in particular would be very difficult, and that the Anglo-American relationship might suffer as a result. So the bonding business was terribly important. And the Americans themselves, as I said, recognized this. And I was really quite anxious about this. I had asked, after the American election finally became clear, after the Supreme Court delivered its verdict, I'd asked Rove and Rice separately, is the fact that Tony Blair has had this enormously close relationship with a Democratic president, is this going to be a problem? It's going to be a problem for us. And each gave a similar answer, which was basically, it's a good thing for the world that Britain and America are close, and if Clinton and Blair were close to each other, good. That's not a problem for us. As for the future, it was sort of, by your works shall ye be known, sort of thing. Well, let's hope for the best, but time will tell. We're starting with a blank sheet of paper. So I did recount this in my book because I thought it was such an emblematic moment. The other two of them were sitting face to face across a lunch table up at Camp David, very informal, and with a minimum of ceremony, absolute minimum. I think the president said, "Hello, Tony, may I call you Tony? Welcome to Camp David." And Blair, without missing a beat, said, "Well, hello, George. May I call you George? Great to be here. What are we going to talk about?" And Bush says, "Right, well, Colin's got to go, so let's ask him to talk about the Middle East." It's just like that. And you sort of sensed, and the sense developed as the, whatever it was, 36 hours went on, that whatever happened in policy terms, whatever substantive issues arose to challenge them, that these two men were going to get on. And that is exactly what happened. They had a very good weekend together, so did the wives. The press conference probably, when they had the Colgate moment, which you may remember, the press conference didn't really do justice, I don't think, to the nature of the relationship. It already sort of looked promising. And so if we look at what happened from that moment up to, say, the Chequers visit in June, wasn't it? June of that year, and they met at various international meetings from time to time. My memory was a bit slightly confused here, but I remember Condoleezza Rice once saying to me, "Well, the president's just got back," and he said the only human being he felt he could talk to was Tony. The rest of them were sort of like creatures from outer space, or some such phrase. That it was a slowly warming relationship all through the year up to and including the Chequers meeting. Then we had the summer holidays, and then life itself changed for obvious reasons.
I have just two more questions before 9/11. The first is, during that period, again focusing on Iraq, were the members of the administration you were talking to at that time who were beginning to contemplate removing Saddam by force, perhaps even within a fixed period?
I didn't see that emerging from the interagency process at all. Every now and again, one would say to Condoleezza Rice or to Colin Powell, "How is the Iraq review going?" And they would just say, "Well, we're still talking about it," but I mean, it wasn't going anywhere, to be honest with you. And in fact, it looked at the time, particularly after the summer break in early September, it kind of looked like the Bush administration as a whole wasn't going anywhere. It lost a sense of direction very rapidly. And I remember sending a telegram on the 10th of September, literally went out on the eve of 9/11. I think we were about to have a visit by John Prescott, and this was a form of briefing for him, saying this is an administration which appears to be running out of steam, or is losing a sense of direction on the domestic side.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Just to ask, do you mean generally across the whole range of policy?
I do.
Right.
It was
Domestic
this,
and
I'm sorry, let me explain, I'm sort of compressing things a bit here. What had happened domestically was, with immense political effort, Bush put all his political capital, most of his political capital, in those first few months into getting a big tax cut through Congress and for getting benefits in prescription medicine for senior citizens. And he got them, but they were Pyrrhic victories. They exhausted him and he lost his majority in the Senate as a result. And come September 2001, before 9/11, everybody was saying that effort has killed him. Rumsfeld, there was a huge bear market in Rumsfeld's, because he wasn't seen to be reorganizing the Department of Defense as he promised to do. It got lost in detail, so the story went. There was a big bear market in Colin Powell's, because his narrowing and deepening and what he was doing on the Middle East was going nowhere. And there was a cataclysmic market in Paul O'Neill's, who was a Treasury Secretary, was soon to be dismissed. So on the very eve of the great atrocity, it looked like an administration that had got into trouble very quickly.
And just to round off, sorry, Iraq really not figuring very much, if at all.
Iraq was not, it was like a grumbling appendix. That's, I think, the way I would describe it.
But could I press you a little bit on that? Because I'd like very much to know your view and your perception of what was happening with regard to American policy in Iraq and the no-fly zones, the escalation in February and then the subsequent developments. How did they fit into the administration's Iraq policy and to what you saw it as being?
Yes. I'm sorry, I completely forgot the no-fly. The no-fly zones had been a problem under the Clinton administration. People were starting to get anxious about two things. One was that a plane would actually get shot down. And what did you do? What did you do? What kind of reaction did you come up with? And also there were worries about legality. Typically, greater worries on our side than appeared to be on the American side. And if I remember rightly, this anxiety about how long we could sustain the no-fly zones and stay within the law was a rising concern throughout 2000. But if your question is, but were the Americans thinking to themselves, if a plane is shot down, we will invade and overthrow Saddam Hussein? It was not in that category. That was not the context in which we were talking about it.
There would be retaliation. But
there would be, well, there would be, I mean, the Americans would say, of course, if they shoot down one of our planes,
right,
we'll kick the shit out of them for doing it. We had worries not only about the no-fly zones themselves and the legitimacy of aircraft overflying, but we were very much concerned by the proportionality, as in the legal sense of the word, of any retaliation.
So we were trying to exercise a restraining influence within what we saw as the legal framework.
I suppose so, and but we were never put to the test. Thank God, it never happened.
No. Well, that brings us to 9/11, which was a very different sort of test. And I suppose the real question is, at what point after 9/11 did the policy specifically towards Iraq change and sharpen?
Well, again, I couldn't find any record of this in the archives. On 9/11 itself, in the course of the day, I had a telephone conversation with Rice, and condolences, anything we can do to help. Who do you think did it? And she said, well, there's no doubt this has been an Al-Qaeda operation. But at the end of the conversation, we're just looking to see whether there could possibly be any connection with Saddam Hussein. That was the very first time, on the day itself, that I heard the name of the Iraqi leader mentioned in the context of 9/11. Well, as has been recorded by multiple sources, most of them of American, that little reference to Saddam Hussein in that telephone conversation by the following weekend turned into a big debate at Camp David between President Bush and his principal advisors. And there was a big ding-dong about Iraq. And I debriefed various contacts about this afterwards, and the story varied depending a little bit who you talked to. But it seemed that Paul Wolfowitz, who was there, although he was not a cabinet member, he was a deputy secretary, was there with Rumsfeld, argued very strongly for retaliation that would include Iraq. And it's not clear from the record to what extent he was supported by Rumsfeld. Some people said Rumsfeld was very strongly behind it. Others said Rumsfeld was not. But the decision taken that weekend was that the prime concern was Al-Qaeda. It was Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and Iraq, whatever the policy would be, had to be set aside for the time being. And that is, I believe, exactly what Tony Blair was told when he arrived a few days later on the 20th of September for a meeting with the President. Because Blair was extremely concerned, and rightly so, that the reaction to Al-Qaeda, retaliation against Al-Qaeda, would become diluted, dissipated, by looking at Iraq at the same time, which didn't merit it. So he was coming, he'd sent Bush a message, sort of setting out, his views on what needed to be done, and he argued very strongly for a laser-like focus on Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And by the time he got to Washington on the 20th of September, he found that the door was already open. He didn't have to argue the case. The President had taken that decision.
To return to the topic we were looking at earlier about the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President, and also perhaps between the Prime Minister and the Americans generally, at his speech to the Labour Party conference in October, he spoke very strongly, the phrase you often quote, and rightly so, "We were with you at first, we will stay with you to the last." What I'd like to know is, how did this speech and what it said and what it implied, how did it affect your own work in terms of working with the administration, first of all across the general field of foreign policy, and then again when Iraq came back on the agenda with regard to Iraq?
Well, in those few weeks after 9/11, Tony Blair's reputation in the United States of America was sealed. Continues to this day. The man, above all other Europeans, who came first out of the slips and who expressed his sympathy for, support for the United States of America in its hour of need with unparalleled eloquence. That speech and that particular phrase that you've just quoted, Sir Martin, resonated enormously around the United States. It's a question of whether, which resonated more, was it that or the band of the Coldstream Guards playing the Stars and Stripes at the Changing the Guard very soon after 9/11, which Condi Rice told me made her break down and cry when she saw it on television. So to be ambassador to the United States of America in the slipstream with this stuff was, I make no bones about it, a heady and exhilarating experience. Because wherever you went, you didn't have to do anything, just walk through a door. People will rise to their feet and give you a sort of storming round of applause. So you had to, you had to be careful not to be swept away by this stuff.
Now, how did this affect, and what was your perspective on the relationship of the other figures in Britain, the Minister of Defence, Prime Minister's office, and their American opposite numbers in the aftermath of 9/11? Did they have the knowledge needed of American policy to influence it, again, when eventually Iraq emerged?
Well, we were sending an enormous amount of advice back to London on how the situation was moving and what we thought were the important issues, and the different positions of the different bits of the administration. Because even during the period leading up to 9/11, it became plain. I'm not sure if this is to your point, but I'll say it anyway. It had already become plain that there was a potential problem between Colin Powell on the one side and the Vice President Dick Cheney and the Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld on the other. And this became, on Iraq policy, and indeed on Arab-Israel policy, the fault line that ran through the administration. A fault line which was never covered and which opened ever wider as the months went by. And I think one of our principal purposes for all ministers who came through town, even if they didn't deal directly with foreign policy, but certainly for Robin Cook, and afterwards Jack Straw, was to say, your interlocutor, so we're talking about Secretary of State now, in the State Department, remember, there are a lot of people around in this administration who don't agree with him and are his political enemies. And that begs the question of where was Condoleezza Rice in all of this? And I think if you plot a graph through the months and years up to the Iraq War, you have to say that she more and more was in the camp of Colin Powell's enemies, although she didn't actually see her role as so she said, sort of banging heads together. She chaired the meetings of the so-called Principals Committee, but one of the complaints from a lot of people was that these meetings ended without any proper conclusion because it was impossible to reconcile the views of the big beasts who were dead.
And this
have I answered your, I'm not quite sure I answered your question.
You are answering it.
I am.
You used your phrase big beast, so really I suppose what I want to know now is what was your briefing to the people who are coming over with regard to this fault line in American policy, and how did you feel they could influence it?
Well, if you were talking about Powell, Rice, Cheney, and Rumsfeld, there were very few ministers who came over who actually merited that access.
Right.
So, you're talking about Prime Minister by definition, and that included the President as well. You included the Foreign Secretary, who nearly always got in to see Cheney, but didn't necessarily go and see Rumsfeld. And so, what I used to say to ministers was, on whatever aspect of Iraq policy, the State Department are on board, but you're going to have to argue very fiercely with the Vice President's office, and if they went to see Rumsfeld, with Rumsfeld's office, and also with Condoleezza Rice, how important these matters are. And the one thing that ran all through 2002 in particular was, if it came to war in Iraq, we would all be in much better shape for the war itself and for the aftermath if this was done within the framework of an international coalition blessed by the United Nations. He didn't have to argue that with the State Department. He sure as hell had to argue it with the Vice President and with Rumsfeld, and up to a point with Condoleezza Rice.
That brings me to my last question before I hand over to Sir Roderick Lyne, and it brings me to Crawford in April 2002.
Yeah.
What I'd like to ask you is this: to what extent did American and British policy towards Iraq merge in April 2002 along the lines that you suggested during that weekend at the Crawford Ranch? In particular, Bush's commitment at that time, as he put it, to put Saddam on the spot by following the UN inspector's route, and also by constructing an international coalition, which was the Prime Minister's strong input. How do you feel about that convergence of policy at that time?
Well, it took a while for policy to converge, and I mean, if we're talking about Americans, the President accepting for realpolitik reasons, it would be better to go through the United Nations than not, which was a repudiation of where his vice president stood. It took a while to get there, probably until August of that year. I said in my briefing telegram to Tony Blair before Crawford, a copy of which again I couldn't get hold of in the archive, I said that, and by that time there had been a couple of months, maybe more, 3 months, in which contingency discussion of if it came to a war in Iraq, how would you do it? It was all very, very embryonic. And of course, well, regime change was the formal policy of the United States of America. It didn't necessarily mean an armed invasion at that time, of Iraq. And it may sound like a distinction, or a difference without a distinction, or a distinction without a difference, but it wasn't, not at that time. And so I said to, as I remember it, I said to Tony Blair, the sort of 3 things you really need to focus on when you get to Crawford. One is how to garner international support for a policy of regime change, if that is what it turns out to be. If it involves removing Saddam Hussein, how do you do it? And when do you do it? And the last thing I said, which became a kind of theme of virtually all the reporting I sent back to London in that year, was, above all, I think I used the phrase above all, get them to focus on the aftermath, because if it comes to war and Saddam Hussein is removed, and then and the other thing at that time, Sir Martin, which people tend to forget, is actually what was blazing hot at the time, and a far more immediate problem. It wasn't Iraq, it was the Middle East, because the Intifada had blown up, hideous things were going on in the West Bank, the Israeli army were in the West Bank, and we had prevailed on the Americans. There was one example of British influence working that year, to put out a really tough statement before Tony Blair arrived in Crawford, telling the Israelis, in summary, that they needed to withdraw from the West Bank towns, and withdraw soon. Now, let me be quite frank about this. Crawford was a meeting at the President's Ranch. I took no part in any of the discussions, and there was a large chunk of that time when no advisor was there. I think with David, I don't know whether David Manning's been before you. Yeah, I gather he hasn't, but when David Manning comes before you, he will tell you, I think, that he went there with Jonathan Powell for a discussion of Arab Israel and the Intifada. And it was, I think, at that meeting that there was kind of joint decision between Bush and Blair that Colin Powell should go to the region and get it sorted. And I believe that after that, the two men were alone in the ranch until dinner on the Saturday night, where all the advisors, including myself, turned up. So I'm not entirely clear to this day. I know what the Cabinet Office says were the results of the meeting, but to this day I'm not entirely clear what degree of convergence was, if you like, signed in blood at the Crawford Ranch. There are clues in the speech which Tony Blair gave the next day at College Station, which is one of his best foreign policy speeches. A very fine piece of work.
And how do you assess the balance in that speech between, as it were, potential preemption and the UN route in Iraq?
I think that there were lots of interesting things in that speech. It sort of repays a kind of criminological analysis. To the best of my knowledge, but I may be wrong, this was the first time that Tony Blair had said in public, regime change.
Right.
And his other, he didn't only deal with Iraq, he mentioned other issues as well. But I think what he was trying to do was draw the lessons of 9/11 and apply them to the situation in Iraq, which led to, I think, not inadvertently but deliberately, to a conflation of the threat presented by Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. And it also drew in spirit, I think, on the 1999 Chicago speech on humanitarian intervention. But when you read that, when I heard that speech, I thought that this represents a tightening of the UK-US alliance and a degree of convergence on the danger that Saddam Hussein presented. Compare and contrast with all the hoo-ha about 45 minutes, which I gather was the subject of discussion yesterday, which came up in the autumn. What you had in that speech at College Station was a rather sophisticated argument which was preemption, but which said Saddam is too dangerous, his record is too bad, the potential threat he presents cannot be ignored. I think doing nothing is not an option was a phrase in the speech. And so therefore we have to do something about it. It was a good speech. But it lost influence as months went by.
Well, thank you very much, and Sir Roderick will take that up.
So Christopher, I'd like to come back to Crawford, but before I do so, I'd just like to go back over one or two of the points you've made up to now. Talking about the summer of 2001, you said that the Iraq review wasn't really going anywhere. Indeed, at a time when you said the administration wasn't going anywhere. That was the period in which Britain and the United States tried, and at the time did not succeed, tried to get a smart sanctions resolution through the UN Security Council, and the effort at that stage failed in July of that year. Is the implication of your remarks that this really wasn't a serious exercise from the point of view of the US?
I think it was a serious exercise. I think it was a very serious exercise. I know that Colin Powell took this extremely seriously, and he devoted a vast amount of energy to it. And one of the reasons why people were speculating in September that his star was in the wane was because he had expended so much energy and had come back with virtually nothing. So I would not say that American efforts in this respect were desultory or half-hearted. What they and we couldn't get round was the objections, in particular the French and the Russians, to the kind of stuff we wanted to put in a new Security Council resolution. And then there was trouble, and you have to ask Jeremy Greenstock about this. There was difficulties in the committee that reviewed embargoed items. There was a row about the items. There was also a conceptual problem we had with the United States, which has its origins in the Clinton administration, that you had to construct something which makes the sanctions smarter, threatens Saddam Hussein with dire consequences if he tries to subvert the sanctions or circumvent them, but also offer him the famous light at the end of the tunnel if, against all prognostications, he suddenly became virtuous and came into compliance with the new resolution and those preceding it. And for the Americans, for domestic political reasons, acknowledging that there had to be some kind of incentive to Saddam in a resolution was very hard to sell in Congress in the light of the Iraq Liberation Act. All that said, they tried hard, I thought.
And they included the White House. I mean, you say Colin Powell put a lot of effort into it. Did he have the full backing of the White House in this?
I know, in as far as that, I don't think they were very interested.
They weren't very interested?
I don't think they were very interested.
No.
I mean, Condoleezza Rice kept an eye on it, and she was a very diligent person, and I think was regularly briefed by Colin. But it was clearly Colin Powell's game. Here's the ball, you run with it, see how far you get, and then come back. But it wasn't as if President Bush popped up regularly and said, we must have a new Security Council resolution. That never happened.
And as you already said, the other game was regime change, which was established US policy, inherited from the Clinton administration, but where, as you've also said, the key fault line was whether this was a policy that was actually going to be implemented and how. At what point, and clearly this was after 9/11, did the most senior levels of the US administration settle on a policy of the forcible removal of Saddam Hussein's regime as their primary objective?
I think almost very, once the shock of 9/11 had sunk in, once the anthrax scare had been and gone, this followed the month after 9/11. It's something which when I was in Washington, I didn't give anything like enough importance to. I didn't realize what an impact this had had on the administration. The anthrax scare was, suddenly people were getting letters tainted with anthrax. What we now know, and I didn't realize at the time, was this really steamed up the administration because they thought the last person who's ever used anthrax aggressively was Saddam Hussein in his own country. So anthrax letters going around the place really spooked people. And if you read a book by Joshua Weisberg, I think his name is, called The Bush Tragedy, this is set out in detail, and it led to Dick Cheney suggesting, and being slapped down by the president, the entire population of the United States should be inoculated against smallpox, which would have led to, I think, 20 million deaths or something like that, a byproduct. So, to answer your question, well before the end of the year, those who had been arguing on the right wing that there was a need to settle accounts with Saddam and to do it fast, suddenly got much more traction with the President of the United States. The President himself, as Commander-in-Chief in the war against terrorism, suddenly was reinvigorated and found a real purpose for his presidency, something which had not been evident before 9/11. And I think I use a metaphor in that book where I say it's almost as if the people who really wanted to deal with Iraq and deal with it soon were burst out of the closet door having been blown open by the shock of 9/11. Everything changed after 9/11.
And certainly by the time the President gave his State of the Union address in January of 2002, the Axis of Evil speech, I mean, you say in your book that effectively containment was dead. The President's belief was that Iraq was too dangerous to be left to containment, and he had decided at this point that the officially mandated policy of regime change, I'm quoting from your book, should be actively pursued. Now, at this stage, what was the British government's policy?
Well, the British government's policy was one of profound legal objection to regime change and a belief that it wasn't realistic to seek to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Now, I say that slightly cautiously because I remember an exchange between the British delegation, which comprised John Sawers and Jonathan Powell, with Condoleezza Rice in the visit they paid to Washington, which we haven't mentioned so far, to see members of the administration and waiting. So we're talking about January 2001, and we provided for Powell and Sawers to meet a very wide range of people from the Vice President downwards. And one of those meetings was with Rice, and there was a brief exchange about Iraq, and I remember John Sawers saying, well, the forcible overthrow of the Iraq regime is just not practical. This is not something we can do. And she said, well, hang on a minute, we shouldn't take this option off the table. But the next remark was in the context of Iraqi dissident groups. It wasn't a big land invasion or anything like that. So I've wandered off the subject here. So we had a legal problem with regime change, and at the time, British government efforts were still focused on this narrowing and deepening of sanctions, a policy that was dying before our very eyes.
That's in January 2001.
Yeah.
But by January 2002,
well, everything was changing.
We were still against, the British government was still against regime change. Its policy was still contained.
Policy...
Was it just the lawyers?
It wasn't to abandon containment, but the knowledge that Iraq was under active discussion in Washington in a way that hadn't been the case before, the signals that we were picking up from our military advisors in the British Embassy, that thinking was now going ahead on Iraq, that Rumsfeld had been tasked to think about this and come back, and Rumsfeld and Franks, the general in charge of Central Command, was being told to look at all this. That started wheels turning, I believe, inside the Foreign Office. So by the time you have the first meeting between the President and the Prime Minister, which is at Crawford in April of 2002, they weren't there to talk about containment or sharpening sanctions. There had been a sea change in attitudes in the US administration, to which the British government progressively, from October onwards, had to adapt and make up its mind where it stood on these various issues.
So at what point between October 2002 and Crawford in October 2001, Crawford in April 2002, did your instructions change from you should be advocating containment to the British government supported regime change?
Well, I got a chunky set of instructions in March of 2002.
Instructions from
Very good question. I tell you how I got the instructions. David Manning came.
That's number 10 Downing Street.
Number 10 Downing Street. By that time, the Prime Minister's foreign policy advisor, because he'd taken over from John Sawers in the previous year. In fact, he was in Washington on the very night before 9/11 to meet Condoleezza Rice and others, to break himself in as the Prime Minister's foreign policy advisor. So David Manning came over in March of 2002 with a set of instructions to prepare the way for the Prime Minister's visit at Crawford, which would take place on, what was it, April 6th, 7th and 8th, I think, of that year. And one of the main things that he was seeking to do, and this was new, and I, if you like, borrowed his instructions to do my side of the thing, was to say to the Americans, look, if you want to do regime change, and if this is going to require military action, you guys are powerful enough to do it all on your own. You can do it on your own. You've got the power to do it. But if you're going to do this, and you want your friends and partners to join you, far better then that you should do it inside an alliance, preferably taking the UN route. And that, I think, was the single most important message which was delivered to the US administration at that time. David Manning, of course, had his relationship with his opposite number, Condoleezza Rice, and he spoke to her on that. And then a few days later, I was responsible for dropping the second shoe and had Wolfowitz to lunch, to Sunday lunch, and I went through the same script with him. An account of which, highly classified, sent to only about 3 people in London, in due course appeared in the Sunday Telegraph, photograph and facsimile. So. And this was all about trying to sell to Wolfowitz, who was viscerally hostile to the United Nations. Thought this is not the way to go. We shouldn't be doing this. So I had to come up with a set of arguments which I thought he might find just about appealing enough not to become a serious obstacle to a policy that would involve the UN.
Are you effectively saying that the British government's policy was changed in Washington rather than in London? It was a consequence of Washington that our line had changed, not because we had sat down and decided that this was the correct strategy? I
wouldn't say that it was as extreme poodlish as that. I don't think that is a fair comment. I think one of the things you have to remember is that Tony Blair was a true believer about the wickedness of Saddam Hussein, and his realization of that predates by a very long time the arrival of George Bush in the White House.
And was that the policy of his government or just of himself?
No, I think it was a policy. Can I read you something? May I do this? This is a speech which I may have referred to in the book, but just a paragraph here. This is a speech Tony Blair made in January 1998, which is, again, context. And I quote, 1998, which is early. He hadn't even been Prime Minister for a year. "We have a clear responsibility in the interest of long-term peace in the world to stop Saddam Hussein from defying the judgment of the world's community. He must be either persuaded by diplomacy or made by force to yield up his long-cherished ambition to develop nuclear, chemical and biological weapons. Weapons which threaten not only his immediate neighbors in the Middle East, but pose a direct and fundamental challenge to world peace. All our experience of him teaches us that it is sometimes hard to succeed with him by diplomacy, but one thing is for sure, diplomacy stands no chance of success at all unless he knows that if he fails to listen to reason, we have the force to back it up." Now, I never saw any evidence over all the years that I was in Washington to that fundamental view ever changed. And I think you can see things, hear things said by Tony Blair years later that reflect that exactly. So I just have read that out to try to set the context of the way in which policy was moving in London.
Now, coming back to the American view, effectively you've said that containment by the early part of 2002 was a dead duck. Where did this leave the policy? Did it mean that, as far as the Americans were concerned, it was simply now only a question of when rather than whether military action would be taken, or was the United States administration still looking at other options?
The way I've always tried to approach this may be the impossible question. The way I've always tried to approach this, and it still gives me reason to think about this even today, is at what point, are you asking me at what point was it clear that war was inevitable? Is it the same question? Because that's a damn hard question to answer. What was inevitable, I think, was that the Americans were going to bust a gut to carry out the mandated policy of regime change.
I'm asking you if they'd left themselves with any alternatives
To regime change?
to
They
taking
couldn't.
military action to effect regime change.
Well, I remember a conversation with Condoleezza Rice in November 2002, a point between the passage of Resolution 1441 and on December the 7th, Saddam Hussein's declaration of his holdings of weapons of mass destruction. I remember having this conversation with Condoleezza Rice, because what I wanted to know was, a bit like First World War mobilization. Whatever you want to do, was it possible to turn the trains around or not? And she said to me, and this offers an answer to your question, I said, what are your priorities? She said, well, the best outcome would be if the pressure of coercive diplomacy, that is to say what's going on at the UN, plus the troop build-up and the knowledge of contingency planning led excuse me, to Saddam's removal. Either he goes off into exile or he is overthrown by an internal coup. That was always an alternative running in the minds of some in the administration. Second worst option, she said, was to be constantly jerked around by an internal process of inspection. And so I said, well, so war is somewhere in the middle between those two things. She said, well, fair enough. So there was always the option. There was always the option that all this stuff that was going on, the rumble of war, would create ructions inside Iraq itself, which would lead to Saddam's removal. Didn't happen. Might have happened if we'd waited a bit longer, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, let's just pursue this UN angle a little further. When you had your celebrated lunch with Wolfowitz, I mean, you said that what was needed was a clever plan to wrong-foot Saddam Hussein, and you said that this should include putting the UN at the heart of this strategy. We need to wrong-foot him in the eyes of the Security Council. One way was to demand the readmission of the UN weapons inspectors into Iraq. If he refused, this would not only put him in the wrong, but also turn the searchlight onto the multiple Security Council resolutions of which he remained a breach. Now, perhaps partly thanks to your eloquence and the British government's persuasion, and also I think to the pressure from Colin Powell, by the autumn of 2002, President Bush has gone to the UN. He has endorsed a strategy of going down what was called the UN route, and this leads up to the new Security Council resolution. Was that just an exercise to wrong-foot Saddam Hussein, as you put it to Wolfowitz?
Well, it was more than that, but you have to aim off here for the person I was talking to. I had to put it in those, how can I put it? I had to put it in those possibly cynical terms to persuade him that this wasn't a limp-wristed, pitiful European lack of will, pathetic type thing of which the Europeans are frequently accused by the Americans, but it was actually a cunning plan to get the guy. Had I been talking to somebody else, like you, I would have said, no, this thing, if we go to war, this thing is going to be incredibly perilous. What we need to do is to refresh the old Security Council resolutions of God knows how many there are, 15, 16, 17, particularly resolutions 678 and 687. We can only do that if we can create some kind of consensus in the UN and get a Security Council resolution that actually provides us with what we need. Then you no longer have to worry about the legality or otherwise of regime change, because you have provided Saddam, through this Security Council resolution, with a set of things that he has to do, which if he doesn't do, you wrong-foot him. And then you can take action. And actually, that is precisely what 1441 did. Unanimously, thanks to an astonishing skill of Jeremy Greenstock in New York and others, we got a unanimous resolution that put, even Syria voted for it, for Pete's sake, which puts all the onus on Saddam to prove his innocence. So if I look back on all that now, and I look back at that conversation with Wolfowitz, what I was saying, and I'm not claiming any kind of prophetic powers here at all, that was what I said we ought to do, and for a moment that's what we got on November the 5th of 2002. It all fell apart for reasons we can discuss in a moment, but that is what we got. And if we were going to go to war with Iraq, that was the best trajectory to follow. Now the British, as you mentioned this, I think, excuse me, played some role in influencing George Bush down this path against the wishes of his vice president, very vociferously expressed. Tony Blair's pressure, Jack Straw's pressure, all played their own part, all played a part in this, and I think pressure from David Manning and from myself. We did play a part. I suspect, though, that the greater part was played by a combination, in this case, of Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, who, in a very private supper with the president on the 5th of August, made the case for taking the international route, the UN route. And the president, a number of times I heard people say this to me, the president, who sometimes is ruled by his heart and sometimes ruled by his head, and the two things would come into conflict from time and time again, in his heart he just wanted to get over there and kick Saddam out. In his head, and he had a very strong sense of realpolitik, he realized he couldn't just do that. And he submitted to the recommendations of his National Security Advisor and his Secretary of State with a chorus of Europeans and an Australian, of whom Tony Blair was the most significant, that he would give the UN route a throw. So when we all came back from our summer holidays in early September, he told Tony Blair and others that that was what he was going to do. But, Sir Roderick, that was only the start of a battle of attrition, where one defensive position after another, erected by the Vice President's office and some in DOD, had to be overcome at the bayonet almost to get Resolution 1441. And it was, for 5 minutes or so, a significant achievement.
So at this point, even if it was only lasting for 5 minutes, in November of 2002, British and American policy have come together with support from the other members of the Security Council in favour of putting the inspectors back into Iraq.
Sorry, Saddam had already agreed before 14-1 to let the inspectors back in. He'd already agreed.
Under pressure,
coercive
and
diplomacy,
the resolution launches unmoving.
Yeah.
Were the British and American governments aiming for the same target through those inspections? I mean, you talk about this war of attrition in Washington. Were the Americans aiming for regime change and the British for the disarmament of Saddam Hussein?
The Americans acknowledged that if Saddam Hussein were to have a kind of Damascene conversion and reveal all and agree to all kinds of confidence-building measures, that in effect, even with him still there, you would have had a kind of regime change. And there was an acknowledgement in London, and Tony Blair, I think, had said this publicly once or twice, and it was grudgingly acknowledged inside the US administration, that it could be possible that in reaction to this concerted pressure of the international community, of which that resolution, 1441, was the high point, that it wouldn't be necessary to go to war. Another way of putting it was that if Saddam had been cleverer, he could have done things which would have made it almost impossible to go to war, but he was not as clever as he was made out to be. So when the inspectors went in, the fervent hope, I think, on the American side was that they would actually act as a tripwire for war. They'd find something, or they would say there's a pattern of non-cooperation. Whereas others hoped that the results of the efforts of the inspectors would be such that Saddam was effectively disarmed and there was no further mystery or obfuscation about what he had and what he didn't have. The real problem, the core of the problem, which I did draw several times the attention of London, was that the contingency military timetable had been decided before the UN inspectors went in under Hans Blix. So you found yourself in a situation in the autumn of 2002 where you couldn't synchronize the military timetable with the inspection timetable. Because there was, the American military had been given instructions to prepare for war. Initially it was, we want you ready by January. And there was a lot of confusion inside the American military establishment about the size of the force and where they should come from. And they wanted to bring an army down from Germany and pass it through Turkey, and the Turks said no. So January was never realistic, and in the end it went back to March. All that said, when you looked at the timetable for the inspections, it was impossible to see how Blix could bring the inspection process to a conclusion, for better or for worse, by March. So, the result of that was to turn Resolution 1441 on its head. Because 1441 had been a challenge to Saddam Hussein, agreed unanimously to prove his innocence. But because you couldn't synchronize the programs, somehow or other, program preparation of war inspections, you had to short-circuit the inspection process by finding the notorious smoking gun. And suddenly, as a matter, because of that, the unforgiving nature of the military timetable, we found ourselves scrabbling for the smoking gun, which was another way of saying, it's not that Saddam now has to prove he's innocent. We've now bloody well got to try and prove he's guilty. And we, the Americans, British, have never really recovered from that, because of course there was no smoking gun.
So the military timetable meant that we simply did not allow enough time for the inspectors to do the job they had been asked to do. And by January 2003, when once again the President is giving a State of the Union address, in your estimation, at that point, he has closed down any option of not going to war? Again, if I quote from your book, on that speech, and he spent about half of his speech on Iraq in, I think, what you also described as messianic terms, very, very strong language. And you said, if the President had left himself any space to step back from war, he closed it down early in 2003 with his State of the Union speech on the 29th of January. Now that's fully 6 weeks before the timetable finally ran out and the inspectors were pulled out, but it's still at a very early stage of the inspections process. They've only been at it for a couple of months up to then.
Yeah.
So the window they were given to operate in was so small, was it a window at all?
Well, so that is an extremely good question. I warned London after Bush announced, shortly before Tony Blair's visit to Camp David on the 7th of September of 2002, I said in a briefing telegram, again which I can't find in the archives, but I promise you it existed. I said in a briefing telegram that, in principle, the British and American sides are agreed that we should exhaust the UN processes, which includes getting inspectors in. And my warning was what the Americans understand by exhausting the UN process and what we understand by exhausting the UN process may prove not to be the same. And there is a very great risk that this will lead to the complete fracturing of the Security Council, which I have to say is what happened. On the American side, there was a very brief hope, and for some disappointment, that after the passage of 1441, that war might be avoided because the pressure now on Saddam was extreme. He was now faced by a united, apparently, united Security Council. Of course, that unity was more apparent than real because it concealed through ambiguity all kinds of differences of national interests, which then exploded later on. Then came Saddam's weapons declaration, the thousands of pages, I think, delivered on December the 7th. And the Americans, the reaction after that, across the whole American administration, including the State Department, was, that's it, he's bullshitting us. You know, this, unless he's removed by force, unless he's toppled, this is it. So, when a few weeks later Bush gives his State of the Union speech, for me, it was quite clearly a summons to war. America, the chosen people, all that stuff which is very common in American oratory, which is very alien to Europeans. I thought, there's no way the President can wind back from this unless, through some event, Saddam Hussein is removed, which he wasn't. So you're right, it is a very short period, but the Americans are getting more and more impatient with this process of inspection. They got very excited when Blix made his first report to the Security Council on January the 29th, that was, it might have been January the 27th, where he seemed to be pretty negative about the pattern of Iraqi cooperation. That pattern of Iraqi cooperation was, for us, the Brits, a very important sign of whether he was in material breach or not, and whether this would be a casus belli. So the Americans got quite excited about that, and as a result, Colin Powell was sent off to New York on February the 5th to deliver his famous speech with all the evidence, which later turned out to be inadequate and correct, of Iraqi malfeasance. This was precisely to convince people there was no point in going on much longer. Unfortunately, Blix then delivers another report after Colin Powell has done his. I can't remember the date, it was I think mid-February or late February, in which he sort of reins back a bit. And of course in Washington the hope and expectation was that Blix, having been fairly negative in January, would be even more negative in February. Didn't happen, but by then all that was too late.
I think they're coming up in a moment or two to a break, but before we do that, I'd like to ask my other colleagues if they'd like to pick up any points from the session so far. Baroness Bouchard.
Thank you. So Christopher, I want to take you back to the time when John Sawyers and Jonathan Powell came. And you said that the question of regime change was discussed, and there was sort of legal objections which were raised. But were they at that time thinking of regime change in terms of military invasion, or was it about kind of toppling Saddam through the dissidents? I mean, was that ever an option that was considered?
I never heard it, Lady Prussia. I never heard, except from Paul Wolfowitz. I talked about this earlier on, and this was in a conversation long before he came into the US administration, who liked this idea of occupying southern Iraq and probably argued for it at that meeting in Camp David over the weekend following 9/11. But the context, as I recall it, in that set of meetings with the administration waiting, the context for violence, if you like, was arming and financing dissident groups, which is provided for explicitly in the Iraq Liberation Act. It actually lists the dissident groups, of which the INC is one. So that's a long answer, but the short answer to your question is no, I didn't hear regime change discussed in any of those meetings in terms of an invasion.
So by that time, regime change had come to mean military invasion?
No, sorry, have I been unclear? Regime change, the official US policy was in practice and in discussion at that time, sharpening sanctions and trying to sort of beef up, stiffen up the resistance groups.
No, what I'm talking about, by the time John Sawyers and Jonathan Powell came to the United States for that meeting, but by that time regime change had come to mean military invasion.
No, it hadn't come to mean military invasion. Regime, at the beginning in January 2001, even if there were individuals scattered around the administration in waiting who would have liked to have done that, the framework in which Sawyers and Powell and I discussed Iraq with Condoleezza Rice was she said, we're going to review Iraq policy, and it never came to any conclusion. B, Colin we'll get him to do sharpening sanctions. And by the way, we shouldn't remove the military option from the table, and we need to encourage and equip the Iraqi opposition. I didn't hear in those exchanges with Sawyers and Powell any reference at all to a land invasion, because I think that was never seriously on the table until 9/11 and the absolutely traumatic impact that had on the US administration.
That's right, because I thought you were talking about a meeting that took place in between January and March 2002. That's the time I'm referring to.
Oh, if I've caused a confusion with the committee, then I'm in trouble here, because the Sawyers-Powell visit was a visit to the administration in waiting. Before the inauguration at the end of January 2001.
Right.
This was an early exchange which foreshadowed the policy that was then pursued between Inauguration Day and, for argument's sake, 9/11.
But by early 2002, regime change had come to mean military invasion.
Effectively, it's still the fomenting of a rebellion, getting another Sunni general of milder disposition, can we put, to remove Saddam. That was around, but at that time the American Armed Forces, Don Rumsfeld, was tasked with making contingency planning about a possible invasion of Iraq. So I hope I haven't caused confusion there. I'm sorry if I've been confusing there.
Can I just ask, again, this post 9/11 period, one of the lines being pursued quite actively, and particularly by Paul Wolfowitz, was the idea that somehow or other Saddam Hussein might have had some responsibility for 9/11 or some links with Al-Qaeda. There was a book that he'd endorsed which suggested the World Trade Center attack of 1993 had been the work of Iraq. Did you have conversations with him or with other members of the administration on that? Was this a line that you found yourself?
I had conversations with him in particular. He was quite convinced that there was a connection, strong connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. There was a constant reference to the fact that Mohammed Atta, one of those responsible for 9/11, who was on one of the planes, had met Iraqi intelligence agents in Prague. Apparently that's not true. Apparently it's rubbish. But you couldn't dig it out of the bloodstream of certain influential members of the US administration. And then there was another thing which would be cited from time to time, which was somewhere up in northern Iraq, I think on the border with Iran, or it might be on the border with Turkey, but I think it's on the border with Iran, there was an Al-Qaeda camp which Saddam was allowing to happen, to do things. Apparently that's not true either. There was some kind of camp up there of insurgent figures, but they weren't an Al-Qaeda operation. In the end, as you, Sir Lawrence, probably know, the Defense Department became so irritated with the perceived bias of the CIA against the intelligence which they, the Department of Defense, wanted to believe, that they created their own in-house intelligence operation which ran as a rival to and a replacement of the CIA. And this is all part, the background to all of this. God knows what was going on in London as far as interagency disputes were taking place, but in Washington there was not simply Colin Powell against Cheney and Rumsfeld. You had the Defense Department, and a degree the Vice President's office, who simply didn't believe what they were being told by the CIA. And the CIA on these matters appeared to be very much in the camp of the State Department.
My next question is about November 2001. This relates to some conversations we had with the Foreign Office and Ministry of Defence on Tuesday. Bush had a press conference in late November 2001 where he was asked about Iraq and said the inspectors should go back, and if they don't, he'll find out what will happen next. And there's quite a lot of discussion in the American media about this, more interviews with Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and so on. This didn't seem to have got back to the Foreign Office. Did you report this as perhaps the first signs of Iraq coming into view?
Oh, I'm sure we did. I don't have the reporting telegram in front of me, but we were watching this stuff like hawks. To a degree, you almost got too close to the coalface. There was no doubting. No doubting the appetite of the number 10, the MOD and Foreign Office for this kind of reporting. Actually, I remember that press conference pretty well. Yeah, of course we did. I say that without actually having it in front of me, but I cannot believe that we didn't report that. So the Foreign Office, I don't think, can claim that they were ignorant of the way in which the wind was blowing. We made it extremely plain. Extremely plain. In fact, I sent a dispatch, kind of thing which ambassadors don't do much nowadays, because I think they've been banned or something like that, on the 5th of November to Jack Straw, which I couldn't find in the archives, which actually tried to pull all these threads together and laid all this out. So there was the embassy staff and I were, I think, maybe even overly assiduous in reporting this stuff. Thank you.
I think this is the moment to take a break, both on behalf of the witness and indeed the committee. We'll come back in 10 minutes. If members of the public need to leave the room, that's fine, but do please come back within 10 minutes, otherwise the doors will be shut, and that'll be it for the morning. So, thank you very much. Again in 10 minutes. Let us resume, if we may, and I'll turn to Sir Roderick Lyne to continue the questioning.
Sir Christopher, we talked earlier about the yes buts, essentially the conditions that the United Kingdom was attaching to joining the Americans in their policy, heading towards military action. What were these conditions?
I only found out about these conditions. No, let me start again. There are two separate things here. The conditions were that the violence between Israel and the Palestinians should be wound down in some way. That was something which Tony Blair and the British government generally repeated very, very frequently as a necessary precondition for taking any action against Saddam Hussein. The construction of a coalition and the exhaustion of the UN process and the re-entry of weapons inspectors. But I only saw these three conditions formally listed as a result of the Crawford meeting through a leak when a Cabinet Office paper, Cabinet Office note I think it was, of July 2002 set them out. I mean, they were part of the diplomacy that we were pursuing. Coalition, UN, do something about the terrible bloodshed between Israel and the Palestinians. But it was never clear to me what extent these were things that we would like to have, or were they actual conditions of going further on Iraq. And I think as time went by, they didn't look much like iron conditions, and the buts were a bit feeble. In fact, I was told by a senior American official not long after Crawford that our yes-but approach, as it were, from Crawford, that the yes was greedily devoured by the American administration, but the buts had kind of faded away.
How was legality, the British view of what was required to satisfy international law, part of these conditions?
Well, if you say, I mean, they weren't formulated. It wasn't formulated like that. But if you were going to go through the UN in the hope of getting an agreed UN position, by definition, the issue of legality would fall away.
And that's what we did.
Well, and you look at the conditions now, so-called conditions. We failed miserably on one, which was trying to wind down the Arab-Israel dispute, where almost things went into reverse rather than going forward.
But just on that...
Do you want me to, sorry, do you want to take each condition one by one?
Let's take that one first. Didn't the Americans in the end agree to publish the route map?
Yeah, but it led to bugger all at the time, and let's be frank about it. The high point of British influence on the Arab-Israel dispute was the American statement of the 4th of April, in which, at a time when the Israeli Defense Force was in West Bank towns, creating some damage and casualties, the Americans called for Israel's early withdrawal from the West Bank towns. That made life infinitely easier for Tony Blair when he came to Crawford and had to do a joint press conference with the President, because if nothing had happened on that, I think it could have revealed a rather large split between Blair and Bush. I say that was a high point of British influence because no sooner had that statement come out demanding the early withdrawal of IDF forces from the West Bank than a major political operation was launched in Washington the following week to reverse the nature of that call. Colin Powell had been sent to the region, as I had said before, and when he came back, he was strongly of the view that he had been consistently undermined by his enemies while he was away, in the administration, in the US Congress, and by someone who is now the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, coming to Washington and effectively working against him.
Okay, so we got some progress on the Middle East, but not in your view nearly enough.
Finish this point, that the definitive American statement was then one made in June, which rode back a long way from what they had said on the 4th of April, and effectively said, in a practical sense, that we'll leave the Middle East on a care and maintenance basis, and by the way, we're not going to do anything until the Palestinians democratize themselves, and what that means is getting rid of Yasser Arafat, which he was not going to do, in fact didn't do until he died.
Now, going through the UN was another condition, going for a Security Council resolution, going for a second Security Council resolution, allowing the inspectors enough time to do their job properly, gearing at least British policy towards disarming Saddam Hussein rather than regime change. Was that a second bundle of conditions?
Well, we had more success with the second bundle of conditions, the UN thing, although of course as ever the devil is in the detail. Exhausting UN processes which included the reintroduction of weapons inspectors into Iraq, it was good as far as it went, but as I've said earlier at this session, the definition of exhausting UN processes was far from clear, and I was concerned from very early on that what the Americans thought that meant and what we thought that meant could be very different. You could say that we, the British, overcame a series of major obstacles to get what we wanted in the UN, which reached its climax with Resolution 1441. I mean, just to explain what I mean by getting rid of obstacles. First of all, the US administration had to be persuaded that in principle the UN had a role. Then it had to be persuaded that if the UN were to have a role, there needed to be a Security Council resolution to reflect this. There was a massive battle inside the US administration before President Bush gave his speech to the UN General Assembly on, I think it was on the 14th of September 2002. We didn't know until the last minute, by God we were lobbying hard, whether he'd even refer to resolution. In the end he referred to resolutions. To this day we're not sure whether that was deliberate or whether he meant to say resolution singular, but his what's it called? His
teleprompter.
Thank you. His teleprompter broke down.
That's sort of area of detail.
Well, Christ, the devil's in the detail here, Sir Roderick. I mean, the detail is important. Then we had a huge battle over what would go into the resolution. Then we had a huge battle about what the trigger for war would be. One needs to know these things. This is why 1441 was fatally undermined by the ambiguities necessary to get the consensus.
Let's turn to the third point you mentioned, being part of a wider coalition. How did we do on that one?
Well,
I mean, the answer is fairly self-evident.
I think if you add up all the people who sort of went to Iraq, it actually comes up to quite a respectable number. I can't remember exactly how many. I mean, I think you could count, was it 30 or 40 nations were there? You know, I don't know, in some small numbers. But who was absent, of course, was whose absence in the Security Council, both politically and militarily, were of course a majority of its members.
So why were we not able to exercise more traction? I mean, you say in your book that the United Kingdom, you realised at a certain point the UK had become an Americanised, the indispensable ally. Now, if we were the indispensable ally, couldn't we have had more traction?
With the Americans or with our
the Americans,
colleagues in the Security Council?
No, with the Americans, to get a better overall result on these conditions, on the yes buts.
Well, my view is, and I think I said this in the book as early as 2004, that given the nature of the relationship between Britain and America and the closeness between George W. Bush and Tony Blair, we could have achieved more by playing a tougher role. For example, and this is not the first time I have said it, if we had made it a condition of our participation in any military operation, that indeed a major effort should have been made with the Arab-Israel dispute, and that indeed we should have done detailed planning for what would happen if and when we remove Saddam Hussein, there could have been a very different outcome, but that did not happen.
So in the end, we were left with the choice: do we either continue to go along with the United States, which was taking us into some uncomfortable areas, or should we part company with the United States with all the downside that that would entail? What would have been the consequences for the United Kingdom of parting company with the United States?
Well, it would depend when, it would have depended on when it was done, and it wouldn't necessarily have meant parting company. If, for example, and I wasn't there, but I'm pretty sure it didn't happen. If, for example, at Crawford, Tony Blair had said, I want to help you, George, on this, but I have to say to you in all honesty that I will not be able to take part in any military operation unless we have palpable progress on the Middle East process and we have absolute clarity about what happens in Iraq if it comes to our removing Saddam Hussein. I think that would have changed the nature. It wouldn't have led to a rupture, I think, but it would have changed the nature, I think, of American planning. I think he could have said that even in the September meeting at Camp David, and that would have had an impact. By the time you get nearer the end of the year, it's probably too late because too many things have been decided and are in train. And don't forget, Sir Roderick, that in January or February 2003, before the government in London had the crucial debate in the House of Commons, George Bush picked up the phone and said, it's going to be politically difficult for you, Tony. You can sit out the war. And Rumsfeld said at some stage in answer to a question to a journalist, well, you know, if push comes to shove, we don't need the Brits.
So if we had sat out the war, would it have damaged British interests in the United States, if that's what they were saying to us?
Impossible to say. It is impossible to say. We had a very high reputation at the time inside the United States. There was no great popular surge, as far as we could tell, in favour of going to war. Polls weren't particularly encouraging for the administration. I was travelling a lot around the United States at the time. I didn't come across anybody except an oil man in Houston who was keen on invading. I doubt that it would have done a lot of damage.
In order to be seen as a good ally and reap whatever benefits that produced, was it necessary for us to go in the strength that we did with a very large land contingent, or could we have made a smaller contribution to the operation?
I'm sure we could have made a smaller contribution to the operation. I don't know, because I wasn't in the heart of military planning, along the spectrum of military assistance, what made us fix on the very large land force, by our standards anyway, that we sent in. I remember being told by a member of the administration quite early in 2002 that we were apparently planning to send more or less what we did send. If it, I always have to say if it came to war, because the operational decision had not been taken then. But I think anything that we contributed, apart from, in addition to political support, would have been gratefully received and would have done no damage to our reputation either inside the administration or among the American people at large.
Apart from the applause factor that you mentioned earlier, what benefits to British interests did we gain, did we advance by the role that we took?
That's a great question, and it is one that much preoccupied me. As the months went by in 2002, every now and again I got in touch with the Downing Street and the Foreign Office and saying, I think I said this in my annual review in 2001. I said, it's great to bathe in all this popularity. It's wonderful stuff, being applauded wherever you go. Have your lights up on the scoreboard at a big baseball match in New York. Welcome to the British ambassador. Crowds cheering. I mean, you could I almost felt that I needed somebody sitting behind me whispering in my ear, remember you are mortal. And I said to London, the key thing now, quite apart from Iraq, is to translate this popularity into real achievements which benefit the national interest. And we failed. We failed. I'll tell you where we failed. We failed on persuading the United States administration to liberalize air services across the Atlantic, a very big British interest, such that British Airways and other British airlines could enter into code-sharing agreements with their airline opposite numbers in the United States. Richard Branson had been trying to fly and carry passengers point to point in the US since the beginning of time. It was a major British interest, and I kept on saying, look, let's try and use this capital to get that. The other thing which was profoundly irritating was that almost on the day that 45 Commando arrived in Afghanistan to help with the war, the Americans slapped tariffs on exports from the UK of what they call specialty steel. I remember saying to Karl Rove, what in Christ's name do you think you're doing on something like this? You know, and basically the answer was, well, the steel industry is in terrible trouble. It's in states that are important for the president's re-election effort in 2004. And it's just politics. But what we'll try to do is we'll pass this tariff thing and we'll try and mitigate the consequences for you afterwards. This involved the most incredibly painful diplomacy. And my view is that there, the British government could have and should have made a bigger effort to get what we wanted on those points in return for the assistance we were giving them.
So just to make sure that I've properly understood this, to summarise what you've just said, it wasn't essential for the defence of British interests that we actually played the part that we did choose to play in Iraq. It wasn't essential for reasons of British-American relations that we did so. On the one hand, there wouldn't have been necessarily massive damage if we'd not done so. And on the other hand, we failed to secure specific benefits, and in some cases areas you've identified, steel and air services, that we should have done, other than to become popular by doing what we did.
Well, I don't want to sort of chop logic here, but if you accepted, I mean, I was in favour of removing Saddam Hussein. Let me kind of declare an interest here, Chairman. I thought, just so you can understand where I'm coming from on this, I thought that you didn't even need 9/11. You didn't even need weapons of mass destruction as a clear and present danger. There was a very strong argument, a very strong UN argument for confronting Saddam Hussein, A, because he had not lived up to the commitments in Resolution 687, which was the one which enshrined the ceasefire after the 1991 war. He had chucked out his inspectors effectively, unscom at the end of 1998, and we knew, and we still do know, because we've got this from the Iraq Survey Group, that he had the means and the will to concoct weapons of mass destruction at a later date, even if he didn't have them at the time. I thought, you put all this together, there is a British interest in confronting him through the UN, and we should have done it in 1999, and we couldn't do it because, apart from anything else, the French and the Russians wouldn't allow the Security Council to do it. So that's where I was coming from. It wouldn't have damaged the British interest if we had gone to Iraq in fewer numbers. It would have damaged our relations in the United States if we had actively opposed what the Americans were planning, no doubt about that, I think. We could have done more on issues which some in London may have regarded as minor, but were very important to us. And I'm not sure if in saying all that I've said anything more than what I said the first time around.
No, I just wanted to make sure that I got it straight. I've got one more question only that I wanted to ask, which is about the aftermath planning. But before I do so, perhaps I can just check whether any of my colleagues want to come in on any of these points.
Could I just come in on this question of whether we had an option to walk away? What would have happened, for instance, and I presume you did think of this, if in that speech at the United Nations, with or without the help of the teleprompter, Bush had not mentioned bringing Iraq back to the United Nations, back to the Security Council? Would we have then been unable to take it any further?
I think that might have resulted in impasse. It wasn't only we who were pushing for the UN. Putative allies like the Spaniards, like the Italians, like Australians, were all doing it. So the likelihood of that ever happening was very, very slim. But it is a hypothesis which is worth considering. I think if Bush had decided to repudiate the UN altogether and simply to plough ahead, say, with a coalition of the willing, something like Kosovo, the Kosovo operation, I suspect that would have produced a crisis for us, because I'm not at all sure that the Prime Minister would have been able to have got the thing through the House of Commons.
So it was absolutely a critical moment in this whole story.
I thought it was a critical moment that Bush should agree to refer it to the UN, to refer to resolutions, and there was a period between the meeting in Camp David on the 7th of September and Bush's speech at the UN, which was a week later, I think actually on the 14th, where the needle swung back and forth inside the administration line from one day to the next, from one morning to one afternoon to the next. You didn't know which draft of the speech was going to prevail.
And when you were trying to influence where the needle stopped, were you warning that without a reference to the Security Council, the British role in this enterprise would almost inevitably diminish?
The way I put it was, if we don't get the UN in the speech and we don't make a serious effort to go down the UN path, the first instance of regime change will take place in London.
But that would be assuming that the Prime Minister continued with the support for the policy, but perhaps he could do that. I mean, people often cite the analogy with Harold Wilson and Vietnam. Wilson didn't go to Vietnam in terms of sending British troops, but he took an awful lot of political stick for supporting the Americans in Vietnam.
Yes, it's not if you forgive me, Sir Lawrence, it's not a wholly... It's it was a bad period in UK-US relations. Apart from anything else, President Johnson didn't like the fact that Harold Wilson smoked a pipe in the Oval Office, which has offended some canon and protocol there. But the thing about the Anglo-American relationship, the so-called special relationship, if you look at it since 1945, it's not characterized by its stability. It's characterized by its volatility, its extraordinary ups and its extraordinary downs. Over that period.
I wasn't trying to get into it.
No, well, that's quite interesting. I'm sorry.
That's an extremely interesting question. As a historian, I'd love to go into it. But I'm mainly interested in the analogy of a policy of giving support, political support, which in itself can carry a domestic political price.
Yeah.
And actually sending forces.
No, I understand that, but I cannot conceive that Prime Minister Blair, given what he had said about Saddam Hussein back in 1998, given where he was coming from, would have ever done a Harold Wilson, if I can put it like that. I think Sir Roderick's point about what level of military support might have been an alternative to, what was it, sending an armoured brigade, that I think is more to the point. And I cannot envisage, in the circumstances post 9/11, that Tony Blair would have ever, in the way that Harold Wilson did, put distance between himself and the White House.
But can you imagine him pursuing the military option for the United Kingdom without reference to the United Nations, without going through the UN route?
He had a precedent in Kosovo. which was a successful operation which did not benefit from a Security Council resolution, but it had the informal support, effectively, of the Security Council, and subject to Sir Roderick's views, the acquiescence of the Russians. Iraq wasn't like that. So I think the short answer to your question is it might have been mission impossible to send 50,000 British troops to Iraq without benefit of some kind of process in the Security Council. Of course, it all broke down on the question of the second resolution. So in the end, we did go to Iraq without benefit of a Security Council resolution. But there had at least been an effort. Thank you.
Christopher, was there a sort of a perception in the USA that UK's participation would be inevitable? So in other words, was it taken for granted?
Yeah, it reached a stage where it was taken. Well, I was told by one who was a very regular contact, somebody very senior in the State Department. Also, I had echoes of this from the White House, that is to say from the National Security Council, that, and I warned London about this in the middle of the summer, June or July, that we were, I thought, being taken for granted. Our support was assumed, partly because we were engaged in the contingency planning on the military side, partly I assumed from what Tony Blair had said in private to Bush at Crawford and what he'd said in public the day after at College Station in his speech. So there was an assumption, whatever happens, the Brits are going to be there. And so this goes back to the British interest point that Sir Roderick made. So I did say to London that we've been taken for granted. I've been warned by a couple of very good American contacts. And by the way, what about air services and steel tariffs?
So what you're suggesting is that we did not use any influence that we had as positively as we could have done.
I think we if I put it charitably, we underestimated the leverage at our disposal.
And earlier said that you were travelling around the country a lot and there wasn't much support for the war.
It wasn't that there was building opposition to the war. It was simply that it was quite, I mean, I went to 4 or 5, maybe more, cities in 6 months. Usually you used to do 1 or 2 a month, and you didn't get a sort of great sort of patriotic surge of people punching the air and let's go get Saddam. You didn't get that, and people were quite anxious about it, anxious and cautious about it.
And was that conveyed to the government here by yourself and others?
Yes, absolutely.
And what was the reaction?
There was no reaction. I'm afraid it is in the nature of the bureaucracy that telegrams and reports sent back to headquarters do not always elicit a response.
I understand that, but I meant, what about reaction was, did anything change in practice?
Oh, I could see, no.
Sir Christopher, I want to go briefly into the aftermath. It's an important subject, but I know that Sir Martin's got a couple more questions that he wants to ask you before we finish. Talking of the period in the autumn of 2002, you said in your book that Iraq, post-war Iraq, was a blind spot in Washington. The White House appeared to have bought fully into the neocon idea that with the overthrow of Saddam, all would be sweetness and light in Iraq, with automatic benefits elsewhere in the Middle East. Did that continue to be their view as we moved closer to the conflict? Was participation in planning for the aftermath and having a coherent plan and assessing what was likely to happen in the aftermath one of the conditions that we were trying to set? Perhaps it would be better to call them one of our desiderata, and what actually happened in the period up to the time you left Washington?
Right. A repeated theme of Washington Embassy reporting throughout 2002 was indeed, not just at my level, but other members of the staff in the embassy, telling London variously that after Saddam planning, blind spot, black hole, whatever you like to say, and even in January, February 2003, it was possible for a member of the US administration, quite a senior guy, to say to me, we don't even yet agree on the concepts for the aftermath. And the most authoritative thing I can tell you is, and it is in the book, that I found myself at a dinner in Washington sitting next to Vice President Cheney. And we hadn't yet had the crucial vote in the House of Commons. And he asked me, what all this meant, and I said, the Prime Minister has significant political difficulties in London, and it's going to be difficult to get over them. And his reaction was quite dismissive. Well, once you get by your political problem and we get to Baghdad, then we will be greeted with cheers and flowers or whatever by the population, and all this will be history, will be past history, and you and the President will get the credit which you deserve. There was a significant chunk of the administration that was not particularly concerned about the aftermath because they thought it would come out all right on the night. Condoleezza Rice said to me once, when we were having a conversation about the difficulties that might emerge after the toppling of Saddam, that the trouble with the Europeans, that we were too sniffy, condescending about the Iraqi people, who were perfectly capable of running a democratic system, and we should allow them to do so. As if you remove Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party and 1,000 Burkes, as it were, B-U-K-E, emerge. I was going to say something else. But basically, to answer your question, nothing really changed on that score. And
so they remained very optimistic.
We
didn't get into a lot of planning with them.
Well, we tried.
I know we tried, but did we succeed?
Well, we didn't succeed because they hadn't got their house in order. I mean, we would send teams over.
So it never really happened?
Well, hang on, let me finish this point. It sort of happened, but it wasn't enough. In the autumn and winter of 2002, teams came over from London, interagency teams, to engage the Americans on afterwards. And what they found was a fragmented American interagency reaction. We knew the State Department had been working on post-Saddam for ages, and had all kinds of terrific plans and some good people who in the end Rumsfeld wouldn't accept in his team. And then, of course, you went to the Department of Defense, you got a different story. The problem about engaging with the Americans on aftermath was that they themselves didn't create their ORHA, Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, thank you, until February 2003. So it wasn't for lack of trying by British officials. And I wasn't present in the meeting between Tony Blair and George Bush, which was a very tightly held one in Washington on January the 31st of 2003, when we know from a leaked record of that meeting, which I believe is to be authentic, that the British team did say to the President, what about the aftermath? To which the response was, it's all in hand. And that was it. That was the full nature of the exchange. I'm not sort of giving any scoops here, because this has been out in the public domain for at least a couple of years. So officials did try to engage, but the heart of the matter was at the political level, we didn't insist enough, and on the American side, they didn't get their act together until very late in the day, and it then turned out the act wasn't good enough anyway, as John Sawers and Jeremy Greenstock will, I think, confirm.
Thank you, Ron. Sir Martin. Yes, I have one last question, Christopher, to go back to the question of British influence on the administration. Do you feel that because of whatever commitment may have been made at Crawford or in the summer after Crawford, that Britain's ability, say through the Foreign Secretary, to influence the United States policy was fatally undermined? Or would you say that Bush's commitment to the UN route in his Security Council speech was in fact the maximum and essential acceptance of the conditions which we had laid down?
I thought the Bush speech was a very good result for us, the United Kingdom, as far as it went. It was extraordinarily emollient about the UN as a whole. It announced, incredibly enough, this really blindsided me, the re-entry of the United States into UNESCO, which I thought was staggering. It was a very, very good result, and I'm in danger of repeating myself now, and it was the result of a lot of influences playing on the White House, including Jack Straw with Colin Powell, though Colin Powell needed no convincing, and a number of others. So it was a kind of high tide, and we managed to keep the tide pretty high until the resolution itself emerged 2 months after the President's speech. It must be said this, that Resolution 1441 was a significant diplomatic achievement, but it had the seeds of its own destruction in its ambiguity. And its ambiguity was on the crucial point on what would be the trigger for war. The Americans interpreted it one way, and everybody else interpreted it the other way, and we were kind of stuck in the middle.
But our input, including that of Downing Street, on the speech of the Security Council was really our position being accepted. And
it was our position being accepted, but I would not say that our lobbying was decisive. I think the meeting, the August the 5th meeting, which Powell and Rice had with the President, that was decisive. And in fairness, I must say that one of the arguments that Colin Powell used was our indispensable allies need this. It was part of the baggage of arguments that he presented to the President, who, as far as I could see, from what I've heard, didn't didn't need a lot of convincing.
Anything else, Martha? No? No? Lawrence?
Can I just carry on a little bit with this question of influence? You've set out the conditions that were sort of made at Crawford, but they were never sort of red lines in the sense that they were announced to Parliament as such. So these were rather informal conditions, is that fair? Were these the best conditions that we could have set under the circumstances? I think it would have been rather difficult to lay down as a condition support for Virgin Airlines. That was something that we...
Mr. Branson would have liked.
I'm sure he would, but I don't think that... So I'm just really within the ambit of policy on Iraq. Was there a way that we might have formulated the policy then, so that, in a sense, by putting ourselves in a corner, it would have been understood that it was harder for the Prime Minister to move away from these conditions?
I think the key condition, a key condition, that should have been a red line, but wasn't, was that the military processes and decision-taking should be subordinate to a coherent political and diplomatic strategy. Part of the difficulties that emerged was that, as I've said earlier on, a provisional timetable, a contingency timetable for possible military action was set for early 2003, which was, in reality, if you were going to go through the UN, to set the cart before the horse. And so with the benefit of hindsight, hindsight plays quite a big role in all of this, I think what we should have said was, let's try it through the UN, let us exhaust the UN processes, including the reintroduction of inspectors, and then, depending on what Saddam Hussein does, decide what, if anything, we're going to do militarily. Now, of course, you can't just do it neatly like that. You've got to have some contingency planning. But I think, and I go back to what I wrote at the time, that it wouldn't necessarily have been a panacea. It wouldn't necessarily have solved all the contradictions and problems that arose. But if you actually planned for military action in the cool autumnal season of 2003 rather than the cool spring season of 2003, a lot of things might have been able to have been unwound. But the key problem was to let the military strategy wag the political and diplomatic strategy. It should have been the other way around.
And when did you become aware that the military strategy, the timetable, was so firmly in place? Because it did move a bit during the course of 2002.
Yeah, what you started to hear quite soon was all our contingency planning is premised on doing Iraq in, I mean, the month January kept popping up. Then after the summer break of 2002, and I stress this was contingency. I am not somebody who believes that an operational decision was taken in April 2002 or September 2002. And then I began to hear in October of 2002, suitably at a Trafalgar night dinner in the embassy when masses of American military turn up, I began to hear that January doesn't work because we're not ready and we've got this problem with the Turks. So the thing started to go back to February, and in the end it turned out to be March. So it was a sliding scale, but it was a sliding scale within a very narrow bracket, actually.
And how much understanding was there between Britain and the United States that this was an effective deadline? Were the British able to say it would help if you could push it back at least till late April? Was there any discussions of that sort?
Well, there was. Well, one of the most signal discussions of that, I think, was when Tony Blair came to Washington on January the 31st, 2003. And he was seeking delay, because I think we weren't militarily ready, and he wanted his time for a second Security Council resolution, which at that time didn't look unachievable. And I remember sending a telegram the night before saying, on these 2 points you haven't won the argument yet. You're going to have to say to the President, I need a delay and I need a second Security Council resolution. And to be fair, he got the Americans to make an attempt for a second Security Council resolution, but again the Americans have been pressed by Aznar, the Spanish Prime Minister, by Berlusconi, by John Howard down in Australia. And there was a delay until March the 20th, but the delay was not because we argued for it, it was because the American military said, hell, we can't do this thing, actually, until March the 20th. But strategically speaking, it didn't matter whether it was in January or in March. If you believe, as I do, that it should have been wrapped into a coherent political and diplomatic strategy, he would have gone for the autumn. But yeah.
And so, just to conclude this, in a way, maybe he got the worst of both worlds. That he got a return to the Security Council, but without the time to work it all through under this constant pressure, and an awareness that the military build-up was taking place.
I think that is what happened, and it goes back to what I said earlier, that it turned Resolution 1441 on its head, and in fact we found ourselves, instead of trying to get Saddam Hussein to prove his innocence, we found ourselves in the intolerable position of having to try to prove his guilt by finding weapons of mass destruction before the military deadline, which proved impossible.
Okay, my very final point, on the at this meeting in January 31st, you mentioned already that the aftermath issue came up there. We've had a lot of discussion of sort of the worst case on the weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be completely wrong. You've also now indicated a best case on what would happen after the war. Was there any sense, any concept at all of just how awful it could be? Or do you think this was just outside of everybody's...
So,
how awful the aftermath could be? In the discussions in Washington or around at the time?
I think the worry at the time was that there would be some kind of humanitarian disaster, and the initial work of the ORHA under General J. Garner was very much focused on that, refugees and stuff like that. And this argument about were there or weren't there weapons of mass destruction will go backwards and forwards, I suspect, until the end of time. But I mean, American and British troops wouldn't have been equipped with anti-chemical weapon defences if there hadn't been a very strong fear, however ill-founded, that Saddam could respond with these weapons. What just disappeared from the calculations was the understanding that after Saddam was toppled, you're going to have to maintain law and order and guarantee the continuity of essential services. Otherwise, you'd lose the Iraqi population very rapidly. And that was discussed. But when it happened, when the invasion happened, when Baghdad was captured, the division, the US Army division that was there, didn't do that because it didn't have any orders to do that. And that, there are other witnesses who will be coming before you who are much better informed on this than I am. I only know what I've read about that because I retired at the end of February.
Thanks very much.
I've just got a few wrap-up points, Christopher, rather sort of all over the space that we've been occupying this morning. But the first one comes from what's just been discussed, and that's whether, looking at the timing decision by the United States to go in early 2003, now whether it's January or March or whatever, military momentum is clearly a major component of that broad timing decision, and we'll hear a lot more from other witnesses about that. There are, however, some signs, aren't there, that the American military or people within the American military at a responsible level believe they could fight a summer war, if indeed it wasn't held over till the autumn. It wasn't an absolute no-no that you had to go at the end of March or not go. But is that your understanding?
It is my understanding, and the reason why I've said autumn, because in the following year, in 2004, there would be a presidential election campaign.
You've brought me exactly to the question I was going to put.
I thought, hang on, this is, if one's trying to buy time in all of this, how much time can you buy? So I went to the great guru, a chap known as the President's Brain, Karl Rove, and I said, how far can this be put back? And he said, end of 2003 latest. He might have said January 2004. Otherwise, he said it'll get embroiled in the presidential election campaign, and the president will be accused of using the war to win an election.
But the decision on early 2003 is not driven by the domestic US political timetable.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. It just, actually, I don't know where it came from, to be perfectly frank with you. It might have been a purely military planning option.
Or just the inertia of preparation, military preparation.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know.
Right. Okay. Two other points, one partly connected with the post-war planning, but you said that, in effect, the British Prime Minister had more leverage than the British government exerted, in effect, both before and indeed in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion. And Sir Lawrence raised this enticing question as to whether, had the British government, had the British Prime Minister been more explicit about his conditions, would that have, as it were, made it easier to enforce them or to exact a price? The other, though, is timing, and I think I took from what you were saying that really the persuasive, the influential effect in 2002 came in too late. If you're looking at, for example, much more careful and detailed aftermath planning, that it would have had to be, the British influence on it would have had to be exerted by the summer of 2002 at latest to get something really serious up and running. Is that right?
Yes. I can't give a categorical answer to that. don't believe that it would have been impossible if we started this in the autumn, but had an interlocutor who got their act together. I think if the Americans had their act together in September, October, and we did likewise, then you could have done it. And I'm not trying to make a party political point here whatsoever, but quite often I think about this. I think, what would Margaret Thatcher have done? And she would have insisted on a clear. I take her name in vain, for Pete's sake. I may be hit with a thunderbolt, but I think she would have insisted on a clear, coherent political diplomatic strategy, and I think she would have demanded the greatest clarity about what the heck happened if and when we removed Saddam Hussein.
On the aftermath planning, looking to the content and the substance of it, is it right to suppose that the de-Baathification element of it, which had itself arguably catastrophic consequences, was really a reaction in April by Bremer to the breakdown in security rather than the precipitating cause? Can you comment on that at all?
It's slightly beyond my time.
If it's outside, then
it is outside. I mean, I don't think. I mean, I have a view, but I left the service on February the 28th. That's my problem.
Yes, but you were there in the run-up. So
yes.
If you have a view, let us.
Well, there was a view that would. I mean, there were a number of parallels were thrown into discussion. One was MacArthur in Japan. The other was what we did in Germany after 1945. People were looking for parallels, and I remember somebody from the NSC saying to me in January, clearly we're going to have to get rid of the top people, Saddam's henchmen, but we can't de-Baathify completely, otherwise there'll be no administration in Iraq and no school teachers and no nothing, and we're going to need some of these people.
That's important to hear, thank you, because there was awareness then, at least in some parts.
Yeah, but the argument was lost.
Yeah, okay. Moving back to something quite different, you said earlier this morning that in your view the declared formal United Kingdom policy on containment was in effect over by spring-summer of 2002. We have had other witness testimony to argue that it was and remained the policy at least until late in 2002. Looking back at it, where do you think that line should be drawn?
I can't do that, actually. The trouble is, I think this in itself is a comment on the importance, the salience of that issue, is I can't really remember ever in 2002 going in to see somebody senior in the administration still arguing about containment. I think it may have, its death twitches may have lasted quite a long time. But I don't remember ever doing this.
But basically, it's not a time point, it's just an evolution.
Yeah. And it was nowhere in the briefing that I remember sending to Tony Blair for the Crawford meeting.
Right. Quite different point, but you gave us evidence earlier about the relationship between interlocutors on either side of the Atlantic. There's an asymmetry, of course, in the situation. But as I understand it, the number 10 Foreign Affairs Advisor relationship with the head of the National Security Council had worked through different personalities and times. In the Bush administration, the great influence of Vice President Cheney did not lend itself to a natural bilateral relationship with either the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister. So how was that going to be managed? How was it managed?
Well, the answer is, I say this in all due modesty, the answer is me. Really, not. Let me back up a bit. You're absolutely right. Institutionally, if you've got a very powerful vice president,
which is hugely unusual.
Which is unusual. I remember saying to London quite early on in the administration, this may be the most powerful vice president ever. And I mean, his institutional opposite number was the Deputy Prime Minister. This, how can I put it, was a unbalanced relationship and probably didn't reap the dividends that institutionally you might have hoped and expected. What we did instead Jack Straw used to see Cheney.
mentioned that the
from
Foreign
time to
Secretary would
whenever he
call.
came to Washington, he saw Cheney.
Yeah.
Prime Minister saw Cheney on the first visit in February 2001, and Cheney, most importantly, was at the Camp David meeting on the 7th of September 2002. For the rest, in between, I would see the Vice President from time to time, but a very good contact was his Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby, and my staff in the embassy had very close contacts with the next layer down, particularly a chap called John Hanna and Eric Edelman, who were strong neocon hawks, and that was the way we put our fix into the Vice President's office and took stuff out.
Thank you, that's helpful. So there was a conduit of communication.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I've got a couple of final remarks after we close the evidence, but just before I do that, are there any particular points that you had wanted to put in evidence this morning that there has not been an opportunity to do?
I don't think so. My mind is slightly mushy at the moment after
been a long
pummeling. But I think I just think I'd like to go back to something which I asked, if I could say, which is to remind people that there is on the matter of Iraq, on the whole question of unilateralism versus multilateralism, which is kind of sort of philosophical discussion one has about the British-American relationship sometimes, or the Americans' role in the world, there is more of a continuum here with previous administrations before George W. than maybe the Democratic Party and the Republican Party would be willing to admit. There's a lot of continuity with some of the stuff that Clinton did. Clinton and Bush, very, very different. But I just think that it would be wrong to see the Bush administration simply as an unusual and atypical aberration that suddenly appeared on the scene. It's not like that.
Thank you. Well, that brings this session to a close. Sir Christopher referred to a number of telegrams or other communications not made available to him from the FCO archive. Just to say, we shall of course be pursuing that to ensure that, assuming that there is a documentary survival, we shall have those in the vast amount of information we've already got, and to which others is still being added. Well, that concludes the first of our sessions on the Anglo-US dimension, and tomorrow we pursue the same theme with Sir Jeremy Greenstock as our witness in the morning, both of course on the United States and the interrelated United Nations aspects. With that, I thank everybody who's spent time here this morning and our witness. Thank you.
Thank you very much.